Spring 1945. The final act of the bloodiest war in human history is being written in fire and steel across the crumbling body of the Third Reich. In the headquarters of the Second Belarusian Front, the air is a living thing, thick with cigarette smoke, tension, and the particular exhaustion that only comes from years of bearing witness to death on an industrial scale. Outside, the guns still thunder. Inside, men in uniforms move quietly, efficiently, like gears in a machine that has been running so long it no longer needs a hand to guide it. The paperwork never stops. Even in war, especially in war, the bureaucracy breathes and feeds and multiplies. Award recommendations arrive in stacks, in folders, in bundles tied with rough cord. Generals review them the way a surgeon reviews charts, with professional detachment, with trained eyes that have learned to process grief and heroism alike as data, as information, as coordinates on a map of human endurance. On this particular morning, a general sits behind a wide desk covered in papers. His uniform is pressed despite everything. His eyes are steady despite everything. He has reviewed hundreds of award nominations this month alone, thousands this year. Each one represents a human being who did something extraordinary in circumstances that would have broken most people entirely. He has learned to process these stories quickly. He has learned not to let them linger. And then his hand stops. His fingers rest on a single document in the pile. His eyes, those trained, professional, war-hardened eyes, move across the text once, then again, more slowly, the way a man rereads a sentence he cannot quite believe the first time. The room continues its quiet hum around him. Somewhere outside, artillery speaks in the distance, a low, rhythmic conversation that has become the background music of these years. But in this moment, for this general, the world has narrowed to a single page. He looks up. His adjutant stands nearby. "Is this," the general says, and his voice carries something in it that almost never surfaces in headquarters anymore. Genuine disbelief. "The same Shilin?" "Yes, sir," the adjutant replies. And in his voice, too, there's something unusual. Something that sounds almost like awe. The name on the document is Shilin Afanasy Prokhorovich. Year of birth, 1924. Rank, First Lieutenant of Artillery. Age, 20 years old. Recommendation, second Gold Star of the Hero of the Soviet Union. Twice, 20 years old. The silence that follows is not the comfortable, familiar silence of a working room. It is the silence of people confronting something that does not fit inside the architecture of their understanding. In the Soviet Union, in the spring of 1945, the title of twice Hero of the Soviet Union exists. It is not theoretical, but it belongs to a very particular world. A world of marshals and supreme commanders, of legendary pilots who have shot down dozens of enemy aircraft, of men whose names have already become chapters in the living history of the nation. It belongs to Georgy Zhukov, the Iron Marshal whose strategic genius has defined the Eastern Front. To Alexander Pokryshkin, the aviation ace who rewrote the rules of aerial combat. To Ivan Kozadub, who flew and fought with the lethal precision of a natural predator. To men whose careers span decades, whose experience is measured in years of leadership, whose understanding of war has been purchased through 10,000 hours of command. And now, into that world, this document inserts a 20-year-old lieutenant. Not a marshal, not a general, not a legendary commander of armies. A boy from a village in the Saratov region who, 5 years ago, was probably chasing friends down a dusty road between fields, thinking about what he might be when he grew up in the bright and ordinary future that the country kept promising its children. How does something like this happen? That is the question that freezes the general's hand on the paper. That is the question that makes the adjutant's voice go quiet and strange. That is the question that will ripple outward from this headquarters, through the army, through the country, becoming something larger than a question, becoming a mystery a legend, a story that people will repeat for as long as there are people who care about what human beings are capable of when everything is on the line. To understand the answer, we have to go back, far back, to the beginning, to a place where none of this was written yet, where the future was still blank, still open, still entirely unimaginable. We have to go to Elshenka. The village of Elshenka sits in the Saratov region of Russia, in the vast agricultural heartland where the land is flat and the sky is enormous, and the seasons mark time more honestly than any calendar. In 1924, when Afanasy Prokhorovich Shilin was born, Elshenka was a community of farmers, people whose lives were organized around the rhythms of soil and weather, around the collective effort of growing things, around the ancient human knowledge of how to make a harvest from difficult ground. There was nothing unusual about the Shilin family. Nothing that would have drawn a historian's eye. Nothing that would have caused a stranger passing through to pause and take note. They were ordinary people in the most dignified sense of that word. People who worked, who endured, who raised their children with the practical wisdom of those who have learned that life rewards persistence and punishes pretension. Young Afanasy grew up the way millions of Soviet children grew up in those years. School in the mornings, the village school, where learning happened under conditions that would have seemed Spartan even by the standards of the time. Afternoons helping at the collective farm, because every pair of hands mattered and childhood was not a protected sanctuary from the demands of survival, but a gradual initiation into the responsibilities of adult life. Evenings with friends, the universal currency of boyhood, games in the street, conversations about the future, the particular joy of being young in a world that feels full of possibility. He was not remarkable in the ways we tend to celebrate. He was not a prodigy of mathematics or a natural leader who commanded the attention of everyone in a room. He did not display early signs of military genius, did not show some special gift that would have allowed a perceptive observer to look at him and say, "This one will be different." He was by all accounts available to us, simply a boy, curious, energetic, present in the way that children are present, living entirely inside the moment without any awareness that moments are being stored up for something larger. This ordinariness is not a detail to skip over. It is in fact the most important fact about Afanasy Shilin's early life. Because what his story will eventually ask us to confront is not the exceptional development of a person who is always destined for greatness. What will ask us to confront is something far more disturbing, far more wondrous, far more relevant to every person who reads these words. What ordinary people are capable of when the ordinary is stripped away. But in the 1930s, none of that was visible yet. The future was still a field of blank pages. He finished school. He was reaching the age when young men in Soviet villages began thinking seriously about what came next, about vocational training, about university perhaps, about the specific shape their contribution to the great collective project would take. The country was building itself, loudly and constantly, full of propaganda and genuine ambition in roughly equal measure, and young people were supposed to find their place in that construction. Then, on June 22nd, 1941, everything that had seemed permanent became temporary in a single morning. The German invasion of the Soviet Union is one of the largest military operations in the history of warfare. In terms of scale, the number of soldiers, the length of the front, the quantity of machinery, the geographic territory involved, it has no precise parallel. Within hours of the initial assault, the border regions of the Soviet Union were in chaos. Within days, entire armies had been surrounded. Within weeks, the enemy had advanced hundreds of kilometers into Soviet territory, taking prisoners by the hundreds of thousands, leaving devastation behind them that beggars description. The country reacted with a particular kind of collective psychological shock. The shock of a people who had been told, officially and repeatedly, that they were strong, that they were prepared, that the enemy would be stopped at the border and driven back. Instead, the border had shattered. Instead, The enemy was deep inside the homeland, moving fast, leaving fire and ruin. And from that shock came something remarkable, an outpouring of voluntary enlistment that has few precedents in modern history. Millions of Soviet citizens, men of all ages, young men barely past the threshold of adulthood, boys who in any other time would have been told to stay home and wait, walked into military recruitment offices and said, "I want to fight." Afanasy Shilin was 17 years old. He had just received his school leaving certificate, that piece of paper that represented the formal conclusion of his education, the official passport into adult life. He had not yet had a single day to imagine what adult life in peacetime might look like for him. There had been no time. The world had changed overnight, and the future that had seemed like an open question was now answering itself in a language of urgency and duty. He walked into the military commissariat without waiting to be called. This is a fact that matters. He was not conscripted. He was not responding to an order. He chose. And this act of choosing, this moment of voluntary decision made by a 17-year-old in a village in the Saratov region, is where the story of Afanasy Shilin truly begins. Not in the spectacular moments of battle that would come later, but in the quiet, unglamorous, entirely ordinary office of a recruitment station where a boy sat across from an official and said, simply, "I want to serve." They sent him to artillery school. Not the years-long program of peacetime military education, but the accelerated, compressed, ruthlessly efficient course that wartime necessity had created. 6 months to transform civilians into officers, to take young people with no military background and teach them the mathematics of destruction, the geometry of fire. The command principles that could mean the difference between a battery that holds and a battery that breaks. 6 months. The curriculum was brutal in its intensity. Ballistics and trigonometry. Command procedures and communications. The mechanical reality of artillery. How the guns work. How they fail. How they are maintained and repaired and positioned and repositioned under fire. The human reality of command. How you speak to men. How you give orders that will be followed, how you make decisions under conditions of incomplete information and extreme stress and consequences that are measured in lives. By the end of 1943, Afanasy Shilin was 19 years old. He held the rank of first lieutenant. He had been given command of an artillery battery, and the men in that battery, the grown men, the veterans, the soldiers who had already seen what war actually looked like from the inside, looked at their new young commander and felt, understandably, a certain skepticism. Not hostility, perhaps, but the natural, reasonable doubt that arises when experience confronts youth, when men who have paid for their understanding and suffering look at someone who has not yet paid the same price and wonder, what could he possibly know that we do not already know better? That question, that silent, justified, entirely reasonable question in the eyes of his soldiers, was the first test Afanasy Shilin had to pass. Not a test of courage in the traditional sense. Not a test of skill, though skill would matter enormously soon enough. A test of something harder to name. The capacity to earn, through action, a respect that cannot be given, cannot be ordered, cannot be manufactured. The front lay ahead. The answer was waiting somewhere in the smoke. Standing in that headquarters in the spring of 1945, the general holds the award document in his hands and feels the weight of a story he has not yet fully read. He knows the name now. The country knows the name. The newspapers have printed it. The radio has spoken it into the air above 100 million listeners. He knows what Afanasy Shilin did in the broad strokes, in the official language of citations and commendations. But knowing what a person did is not the same as understanding how they did it. And understanding how is not the same as grasping why. Why this particular person, from this particular village, at this particular age, found within himself the capacity for what the documents described. That is the mystery. That is what we are here to investigate. And the investigation begins, as all honest investigations must, Not with the spectacular conclusion, but with the unremarkable beginning. With a boy in a village, with an ordinary family, with a future that had not yet been written, and with a choice made in a doorway that changed everything that came after. The question is not whether it happened. The papers in the general's hands prove that it happened. The question is how a human being becomes capable of something like this. That is what we're going to find out. There is a particular quality to the silence before a battle that veterans describe and civilians cannot fully imagine. It is not peaceful. It is not the silence of absence. It is a silence with mass and pressure. The silence of 10,000 people holding their breath simultaneously, of machines and animals, and the earth itself waiting for something that cannot be stopped and cannot be survived the same way on the other side. It is the silence of a world on the edge of transformation, when everything that exists in this moment is about to be replaced by something unrecognizable. In the autumn of 1943, that silence lay over the eastern bank of the Dnieper River like a living creature. Afanasy Shilin stood inside it. 19 years old, the ink on his lieutenant's commission still almost fresh. The men of his battery around him, men older, heavier, more weathered, men whose faces carried the particular architecture of people who have already looked at death from close range and made their peace with the proximity. They stood and waited, and the river moved in front of them, wide and dark and indifferent, carrying its ancient water toward the sea as it had done for thousands of years before any of them were born and would do for thousands of years after all of them were gone. The Dnieper is not a gentle river. It is nearly 1,000 kilometers from its headwaters to the Black Sea. In the regions where the battles of 1943 would be fought, it runs wide and deep and cold, with steep western banks that rise sharply above the water. Natural fortifications that a defending army could use to create a killing ground on the surface of the river itself, targeting anyone attempting to cross with complete visibility and complete advantage. The Germans understood this perfectly. They had not simply occupied the western bank, they had engineered it. Every natural advantage the terrain offered had been multiplied by human ingenuity applied to the problem of mass destruction. Minefields extended back from the water's edge. Hundreds of kilometers of barbed wire, layered and interlocked, created obstacles that slowed movement and exposed men to fire. Reinforced concrete bunkers, what military terminology calls pillboxes, were positioned to cover every approach. Artillery pieces had been pre-targeted on every section of the river's surface, calibrated in advance so that gunners could hit specific coordinates without even needing to see their targets. Machine gun positions had been placed to create overlapping fields of fire, so that there was no point on the water that was not within range of at least two separate weapons. The Germans called this defensive line the Eastern Wall. They presented it to their own people and to the world as impenetrable. A fortress made of geography and concrete and steel, behind which the Reich could stabilize after the catastrophic losses at Kursk, could regroup, could prepare for whatever came next. And then came the order from Moscow. Short, precise, without any acknowledgement of the difficulty it contained. Cross the Dnieper. Take Kiev by the anniversary of the revolution. You have 3 days to prepare. 3 days to cross a river that the enemy had spent months turning into a death trap. 3 days to gather the materials, coordinate the units, move the artillery, establish communications, and prepare tens of thousands of soldiers for an operation that military logic suggested was extremely expensive in human terms. The materials were not sufficient. This is a fact, not a criticism. It is simply the reality of what the crossing looked like from the ground. There were not enough pontoon bridges. There were not enough boats. There were not enough of the engineered solutions that military planning schools teach as the proper method for river crossing operations. What there was instead was the Dnieper itself and the western bank beyond it and the order and the men. They crossed on rafts constructed from whatever timber could be found. They crossed in fishing boats borrowed or requisitioned from villages along the eastern bank. They crossed on barrels lashed together with rope, on improvised flotation devices that an engineer in peacetime would have looked at and dismissed as inadequate for the task. Some men, in some places, crossed by swimming, entering the cold autumn water with their weapons above their heads, moving through the current by willpower alone toward a bank where every weapon pointed at the surface. The river, during those crossings, turned a color that the survivors would describe for the rest of their lives without ever quite finding language equal to the reality of it. Into this, Afanasy Shilin went. His orders were specific. He was to lead his artillery battery's forward observation team across to a small bridgehead, a pocket of ground on the western bank, perhaps several hundred meters of frontage, already seized at enormous cost by infantry units that had preceded him, units that had been fighting continuously since the initial crossing and had been worn down to a fraction of their original strength. The bridgehead was real, but precarious, a sliver of soil held by exhausted men against an enemy that was continuously probing for weaknesses, trying to push the invaders back into the water. His mission, in the language of artillery doctrine, was to serve as a forward observer. This role is one of the most dangerous assignments in artillery warfare, for reasons that are structural rather than incidental. The forward observer must be positioned where he can see the targets, which means he must be at or near the front line of combat, exposed to the same fire that his battery is directing. He's the eyes of the guns. He calls in coordinates, adjusts fire based on where shells land, identifies new targets, and relays their positions to the battery on the other bank. Without him, the artillery fires blind. With him, it becomes a precision instrument. With him present, in a small bridgehead, he is a precision instrument that the enemy desperately wants to eliminate. Because if the forward observer is silenced, the artillery goes blind. Shilin knew all of this. His training had been explicit on the topic. He set up his position on the bridgehead and established communications with his battery across the water. And then the German counterattacks began. What followed over the next 3 days and nights is the kind of thing that military historians describe in terms of operational parameters and tactical outcomes, and that survivors describe in terms that have nothing to do with doctrine and everything to do with the texture of experience at its most extreme. 13 separate counterattacks. German infantry supported by armor. German aircraft attacking the bridgehead from above. The constant, mechanical, relentless application of force against a small piece of ground that both sides understood was critical. The Soviets, because without the bridgehead, there was no crossing. The Germans, because without eliminating the bridgehead, the entire defensive line was threatened. Shilin's battery, firing from the eastern bank on his coordinates, was one of the key instruments of defense. His ability to direct accurate fire at attacking formations, to put shells precisely where they were needed, when they were needed, was the difference between holding and not holding. This is not an exaggeration. In the accounts that survive, in the official citations, and the informal testimonies of men who were there, the battery's fire is described repeatedly as the decisive factor in repelling attacks that should, by the arithmetic of available forces, have succeeded. On the second day, a shell fragment struck Shilin in the head. Let us pause on this for a moment, because the medical reality of what this means is important for understanding what came next. A fragment from an artillery or mortar round carries tremendous energy. When it strikes the skull, the outcomes range across a spectrum from unconsciousness to death, with relatively few stops in between. The wound Shilin received opened his skull, a laceration deep enough to bleed heavily, to cause the kind of disorientation and pain that the human nervous system uses as an emergency signal to force the body toward rest and survival. Another fragment struck his arm. The arm was not functioning properly. The blood was coming fast enough to be serious. The medical personnel present, the unit's medics, trained in battlefield trauma, did what their training told them to do. They approached the forward observer position. They assessed the wounds. They told Shilin that he needed to be evacuated, that his injuries required treatment he could not receive at the front, that remaining in position in his condition was not a viable option. He refused, not in a dramatic way, not with a speech. The accounts suggest he did it simply, with the particular stubbornness of someone who has already made a decision and finds further discussion irrelevant. The position needed a forward observer. His battery needed eyes. The bridgehead needed a hold. He would remain. "I will not leave the battle." The citation records him saying, "I will command." And he did, with his head wrapped in whatever bandaging the medics could apply before he sent them away, with his arm partially functional, with the particular narrowing of consciousness that comes when the body is operating under extreme physiological stress. He continued to call in coordinates. His voice in the radio transmissions, the accounts of the battery operators on the other bank confirmed this, remained clear. The commands were precise. The adjustments were accurate. The attacks came, and he directed fire against them. The attacks were repelled. New attacks came. He directed fire again. 3 days, 3 nights, 13 attempts to push the Soviets back into the river. None of them succeeded. There's a thing that happens in extreme situations that psychologists have studied and soldiers have described across centuries of warfare, and it does not have a clean, single name. It is something like the discovery that the limit you thought you had is not, in fact, the limit, that the wall you were certain you would hit, after which nothing more was possible, turns out to be not a wall, but a threshold, beyond which there is another country of endurance you did not know existed. Most people never find this threshold. Most people live their entire lives within the comfortable borders of ordinary demand, never push far enough or hard enough to discover what is actually on the other side. This is not weakness. It is simply the condition of peacetime existence, which does not routinely require people to exceed what they thought they were capable of. War is different. War applies pressure in a systematic and remorseless way. And what it reveals about human beings is not always the same thing, and is not always what we expect. Some people, under sufficient pressure, discover that they are less than they believed. This is common and understandable, and no cause for condemnation. The capacity for endurance under fire is not evenly distributed, and the people who discover their limits are not lesser human beings for having found them sooner. But some people, under sufficient pressure, discover something else. Afanasy Shilin, on a small bridgehead on the western bank of the Dnieper, with a head wound and a damaged arm and 3 days of continuous combat behind him and the certainty that more was coming, discovered that his limit was somewhere further than he had ever had occasion to locate it. This is not a mystical claim. It is not a suggestion that he was superhuman or uniquely gifted in ways that separate him from ordinary humanity. It is, if anything, the opposite of that. It is the claim that what he did was human, entirely and completely human, which means it represents a possibility latent in human beings as a category. The question of which human beings, under which conditions, and at what cost, that is the harder question, and the one we will continue to examine. His soldiers watched him during those 3 days. The accounts are consistent on this point. The men on the bridgehead, men who had looked at their young lieutenant with skepticism not long before, who had wondered silently what a 19-year-old could possibly know about commanding under pressure, watched what happened and revised their understanding. Not because he was performing heroism for an audience, not because he was trying to demonstrate something to them, but because he simply did not leave, and in not leaving, in remaining at his position with blood on his face and a damaged arm, in continuing to direct fire with calm precision while the bridgehead shook around him, he communicated something that no speech could have communicated as effectively. If he could endure this, they could endure this. If he was still here, they could still be here. There is a military concept called unit cohesion, the degree to which soldiers maintain their collective function under stress, continuing to operate as a coordinated group rather than fragmenting into individuals responding only to their own survival instincts. Unit cohesion is one of the most critical determinants of battlefield effectiveness, and it is notoriously difficult to create and easy to destroy. It depends on trust, on shared experience, on the belief that the people around you will hold their positions. And it depends, more than any doctrine acknowledges, on the behavior of leaders, on whether the person giving orders is demonstrating through their own body, their own presence, their own willingness to absorb what they are asking others to absorb, that the standard they're holding others to is one they hold themselves to first. Shilin held himself to it first. On the bridgehead, surrounded by men who were watching and drawing conclusions, he held himself to it first. When the 3 days ended, when Soviet forces had consolidated the bridgehead sufficiently that the immediate crisis had passed, when the German counterattacks had exhausted themselves against the defenses that Shilin's battery had helped maintain, the accounting began. The military bureaucracy, whatever its other qualities, is thorough in its documentation of extraordinary performance. The witnesses were interviewed. The records were examined. The results of the battery's fire were assessed against the outcome of the defensive action. The award recommendation was written with the particular careful language of official citation. Language that tries to translate human experience into institutional form and inevitably loses something in the process, but that preserves at least the outline of what happened. First Lieutenant Afanasy Shilin, the citation recorded, had maintained his forward observation position under continuous fire for 3 days and nights, directing artillery fire that was instrumental in repelling 13 enemy counterattacks against the bridgehead. He had continued to perform his duties after sustaining wounds that rendered him eligible for evacuation. He had refused evacuation. He had maintained the integrity of his communications and the accuracy of his fire direction throughout. Recommended for the Gold Star of Hero of the Soviet Union. The recommendation was approved. Shilin was 19 years old. He was taken off the bridgehead when the immediate crisis passed. Medics who now had the authority to insist he could no longer refuse evacuation once the operational necessity that had justified his remaining was no longer present, examined his wounds properly for the first time. The assessment was grim. The fragment in his head, the damage to the arm, the cumulative effect of 3 days without adequate rest or nutrition in conditions of sustained extreme stress. He was sent to a field hospital. The doctors there had seen a great deal by this point in the war. They were not easily impressed, not easily surprised, not easily moved by individual cases in an environment where cases arrived in an unbroken stream. But the accounts suggest that even here, even in this context, the young lieutenant attracted a particular quality of attention, perhaps because of his age, perhaps because of the specific nature of his wounds and the explanation attached to them, the reason he had received them, the circumstances under which he had chosen to remain. The newspapers would come soon. The official announcement of the award would ripple outward through the information systems of a country that needed its heroes, that required them the way a body requires oxygen. Not as luxury, but as necessity, as the thing that makes continued function possible. His name would be printed in Krasnaya Zvezda, in Pravda, on the front pages alongside his photograph. The country would learn his name. But in the hospital, none of that had happened yet. He was simply a wounded soldier, young enough to be surprising, lying in a bed and recovering from what his body had been asked to endure. The accounts suggest he was not particularly interested in the attention, that he did not think of himself in the terms that the newspapers would soon apply to him, that his primary concern in those days of recovery was not his own condition but his battery, the men he had left behind, the equipment, the questions of whether they were holding, whether they needed him, whether he was failing them by lying in a hospital bed while the war continued without him. He healed. There is a difference between a soldier and a veteran that has nothing to do with time served or rank achieved or medals worn on a chest. It is a difference in the quality of attention, the way the eyes move through a landscape, the way the mind processes information about terrain and distance and the geometry of danger. The way the body has learned to interpret sounds that to an untrained ear are simply noise, and to a trained one are a detailed map of what is happening and what is about to happen. By the winter of 1945, Afanasy Shilin was a veteran. He was 20 years old. He had been wounded and recovered and returned. He had commanded his battery through the advances that followed the Dnieper crossing, through the grinding westward movement across Belarusia and into Poland, through the months of combat that had transformed the shape of the war from a desperate defense into a relentless offensive. He had learned, in the only school that teaches these things reliably, what it means to make decisions under conditions of incomplete information and total irreversibility. Decisions where the wrong answer kills people you are responsible for, and where the right answer sometimes kills them too, but at least accomplishes something in the process. He wore his gold star. He was aware that the country knew his name. He was aware that something had changed in how his men looked at him, in how his superiors regarded him, in the particular weight of expectation that had settled around him the way reputation always settles around those who have done something publicly extraordinary. He was also aware, in the way that people who have survived one extreme situation are sometimes aware, that survival is not a guarantee. That what happened at the Dnieper was real and documented and could never be taken from him, but that it was also finished. It existed in the past, in the amber of completed time, while the present was still open, still dangerous, still entirely capable of producing outcomes that no prior achievement could prevent. The war was not over. Ahead lay the Vistula. To understand what the Vistula represented in January of 1945, it is necessary to understand the strategic situation of the Third Reich at that precise moment in history, not as it would later be understood, with the clarity that hindsight provides, but as it was understood by the people making decisions in real time on both sides of the conflict. The Reich was contracting. The military disasters of 1943 and 1944 had consumed resources, human, material, territorial, at a rate that could not be sustained indefinitely. The Eastern Front had moved from the outskirts of Moscow and Leningrad to the borders of Germany itself. The Western Front, since the Allied landings in Normandy in the summer of 1944, had established a second pressure from which there was no relief. The war that German planners had expected to conclude in weeks had entered its fifth year, and it was no longer a question of whether Germany would lose, but of how long it would take and at what additional cost. But armies do not simply stop when the strategic calculation turns against them. Soldiers continue to fight for reasons that have nothing to do with the grand sweep of history, for the person beside them, for the ground beneath their feet, for the particular ferocity that comes when men are defending something they understand to be the last line before catastrophe. The German forces arrayed along the Vistula in January of 1945 were not fighting because they believed they could win the war. They were fighting because they had been ordered to, and because the professional culture of the German military in that period made disobedience essentially unthinkable, and because some of them, at least, genuinely believed that every day the front held was a day that might produce some change in circumstances, some intervention, some miracle, some development that the rational mind could not predict, but that exhausted men in desperate situations sometimes permit themselves to imagine. The Magnuszew bridgehead, the specific piece of ground where Afanasy Shilin would face his second and greater test, had been established by Soviet forces in the summer of 1944 during the enormous offensive operation that had driven German forces back hundreds of kilometers. It sat on the western bank of the Vistula, south of Warsaw, occupying territory that both sides understood was not merely ground but geometry, a position from which a future offensive toward Berlin could be launched with decisive effect. The Germans understood this with terrible clarity. To eliminate the Magnuszew bridgehead was to remove the knife pointed at the heart of the Reich's remaining defenses. It was a military objective of the highest possible priority, worth committing the best remaining forces to achieve, worth accepting losses that in an earlier phase of the war would have been considered prohibitive. What they committed was extraordinary, even by the standards of a war that had already exhausted the ordinary vocabulary of military force. The SS divisions sent to destroy the Magnuszew bridgehead were not ordinary formations. They were the elite of what remained of German military power. Formations with names that carried weight even among their enemies. Units that had been built around ideological commitment as much as military training, hardened by years of combat on the Eastern Front into organizations of exceptional ferocity and tactical competence. Their equipment matched their reputation. The heavy tanks that equipped these formations, the vehicles that Soviet soldiers had learned to regard with a particular mixture of professional respect and visceral dread, were among the most formidable armored fighting vehicles of the war. Heavily armored, powerfully armed, capable of destroying Soviet armor at ranges that exceeded the effective return fire capability of many Soviet guns. Facing them in the bridgehead was not an abstract military problem. It was a concrete, immediate physical challenge of the most serious kind. Into this situation, in January of 1945, came First Lieutenant Afanasy Shilin. The cold that January was the kind of cold that Central European winters can produce. Not merely uncomfortable, but genuinely hostile. A cold that penetrates clothing and equipment and human flesh with methodical indifference. That reduces mechanical reliability and human performance alike. That turns the ground to iron and the air to something that scrapes at the lungs with every breath. The snow on the bridgehead was old and compressed. No longer the clean white of fresh snowfall, but the gray-brown of ground that has been walked over and dug into and fought over for months. Shilin established his forward observation position. His battery was on the eastern bank of the Vistula, positioned to provide fire support across the river. The arrangements were familiar. This was the same fundamental structure as the Dnieper crossing. The same relationship between the observer on the exposed forward position and the guns behind him, connected by the radio link that transformed his eyes into the battery's aim. He had done this before. He knew what it required. What he had not done before, what no one involved had done before, at least not in this specific configuration, was face what came next. The German assault began with the particular organized violence of units that know their business. Artillery preparation first, the attempt to destroy or suppress the defenders before the armor moved, to reduce the response capability of the bridgehead so that when the tanks came forward, there was less to oppose them. Soviet positions across the bridgehead absorbed this fire. Men were killed and wounded. Equipment was damaged. The ground that had been a defensive position became a landscape of craters and wreckage. And the soldiers in it adapted, as soldiers do, moving to whatever cover remained, reorganizing around casualties, maintaining function as best they could. Then the tanks came. The sound of heavy armor moving across frozen ground is not easily confused with anything else. It has a quality that seems to operate below the level of hearing, a vibration that enters the body through the feet and the chest before it resolves into identifiable sound. A grinding, mechanical inevitability that experienced soldiers have described as one of the most psychologically challenging aspects of armored assault, because it communicates the scale and mass of what is coming before the visual confirmation arrives. Shilin heard it. He looked through his binoculars at the approaching formation. He began to transmit. The coordinate calls that went back across the river to his battery in those first minutes of the assault were, by every account, exactly what they should have been: precise, calm, rapid, containing the information the gunners needed to bring fire onto the advancing formation. The battery responded. Shells fell among the attacking armor. Some found their marks. The assault continued. This is the essential rhythm of defensive artillery work. The forward observer identifies targets and calls fire. The battery responds. The fire degrades the attack. The attack continues despite the fire, and the observer identifies new targets and calls fire again. It is a rhythm that can be maintained as long as the observer is functional and the battery is functional and the communications between them hold. For a time, on the Magnuszew bridgehead on that January day, the rhythm held, and then it began to break. The degradation of defensive capability under sustained assault is not a dramatic event. It is a process, incremental and grinding, the accumulation of small losses into something that eventually becomes critical. A gun crew here, eliminated by a direct hit. A communications line there, severed by a near miss. A position that had been providing covering fire, suddenly silent because the men operating it are gone. Each individual loss is survivable. The accumulation is not. The Soviet artillery positions on the bridgehead, the guns that Shilin was supporting and coordinating with, the weapons that were holding
The radio in
Shilin's hands
continued
from
to
the defensive
transmit.
lines. His own
Came
battery
under direct
across
fire
the
from the
river
German tanks
was still
as
firing.
those tanks
still
advanced
responding to his
and
coordinates,
found angles of
still
engagement.
putting shells
One
where he
by
told
one,
them to put
the guns
shells.
fell silent.
But the bridgeheads that could be
organic
moved
defensive
sought new
capability,
positions.
the guns that were
the crews that
physically
could not be
present in the
moved
position
remained with their
and could
weapons
engage the
until they
attacking
could
armor
not
at close
remain
range
any longer.
was
Diminishing, and as it diminished, the tactical situation changed. Shifted from a difficult defense into something that had a different name and a different quality of urgency. The German armor was closer now, close enough that the distinction between artillery engagement and direct combat was beginning to collapse. Close enough that Shilin, from his forward observer position, could see the individual vehicles with the naked eye, could make out the specific features of the tanks through his binoculars, the long barrels of the main guns, the pattern of welded armor plates, the vision ports through which the crews inside were watching the same ground he was watching from the other direction. Around him, the bridgehead was contracting. The perimeter was holding, but at constant and accelerating cost, and the arithmetic of attrition was becoming difficult to ignore. There were fewer defenders now than there had been an hour ago. There were fewer guns. There was less of everything that defense requires except the determination of the people who remained, which is a real thing, but is not, by itself, sufficient to stop armor. Shilin continued to direct fire. His voice on the radio remained what it had been at the beginning, controlled, precise, containing no audible acknowledgement of what was happening around him. The battery on the other bank received his transmissions and responded. The correlation between his calls and the falling of shells on targets continued to be accurate. Whatever was happening to him physically, whatever the aggregate effect of cold and stress and the awareness of a narrowing tactical situation was doing to his nervous system, it was not affecting the quality of his work. This is worth understanding. The maintenance of professional function under conditions of extreme stress is not automatic. It requires an active and continuous effort to override the body's emergency response systems. The cascade of physiological reactions that the human organism deploys when it perceives mortal threat, reactions that are very effective at preparing a person to run or fight in a primitive sense, and very unhelpful for the kind of precise, analytical, communicative work that forward observation requires. The ability to call accurate coordinates while everything around you is trying to kill you is not a natural capacity. It is an acquired one, built through training and maintained through will. Shilin maintained it, and then the moment arrived that the citation would describe, inadequately, as extraordinary valor. The gun was alone. Of all the artillery pieces that had been operational on the bridgehead when the assault began, one remained functional. One weapon, intact enough to fire, positioned among the wreckage of a defense that had given everything it had to give. Around it, the crude positions were silent, not because the men had run, but because the men were gone, in a way that men in combat become gone, suddenly and without ceremony. The gun sat there. The German armor was advancing, in the calculation that Shilin made in that moment. And it was a calculation made quickly in the compressed time of crisis, but a calculation nonetheless, not an instinct, not a reflex. Several things were simultaneously true. He was a forward observer. His function was to direct fire. not to serve as a gunner. His training covered observation and communication and the mathematics of indirect fire, not the specific mechanics of operating a gun alone, without a crew, performing simultaneously the functions that were normally divided among several specialists. He was already wounded. The fighting since the assault began had not left him untouched. He was cold and tired in the specific way that people are cold and tired when they have been operating under sustained stress and extreme conditions. He was also the only person present who was capable of doing what needed to be done. He went to the gun. What followed is documented in the citation and confirmed in the accounts of witnesses, soldiers who survived the day and were interviewed afterward, men whose recollections, taken separately and compared, are consistent in their essential details. A 20-year-old lieutenant, alone at an artillery piece, performing the loading and aiming and firing sequence that is designed to be distributed across a crew of trained specialists, working through the physical demands of the work despite wounds and exhaustion. The first round fired. A German tank, advancing, stopped. The second round fired. Another tank. The same result. The sequence continued. Third, fourth, fifth, sixth. Each round loaded by hand. The shells are not light, and loading them is work that leaves no attention for anything else. Work that demands the full physical and cognitive commitment of the person doing it. Each round aimed with the specific knowledge of a man who has spent his career learning to put shells where they need to go. Each round fired at vehicles that were, from the perspective of the person operating the gun, not abstractions, but immediate, concrete, visible threats, advancing with the methodical purpose of machines designed for a specific function. 6 tanks, 3 armored personnel carriers, 9 targets in a language of the citation, 9 vehicles that had been moving forward and were now not moving, were now adding their smoke to the gray winter sky over the Magnuszew bridgehead, were now obstacles rather than threats, were now evidence of something that the surviving defenders of the bridgehead watched from their positions with an experience that several of them would later struggle to articulate, something between disbelief and recognition. The specific quality of witnessing an event that seems impossible until it is, happening in front of you and then seems somehow inevitable. The German assault stalled, not because of what Shilin had done alone, because defensive actions are collective achievements, because the soldiers holding the perimeter and the battery firing from across the river and every element of the defense contributed to the outcome. But the moment at the gun was the pivot. It was the thing that prevented the line from breaking at the point where the line was closest to breaking. When the immediate crisis had passed, when the assault had lost its momentum and the bridgehead had held through the crisis point, the soldiers who came to the gun position found Shilin there. He was without consciousness. The ground around the gun was marked by the evidence of what had happened. He was holding his binoculars, gripping them in a way that suggested the grip had been maintained even through the loss of awareness, as if some part of him, beyond the reach of ordinary volition, refused to release the instrument of his function. He was alive. He was removed from the position with the care that is given to people whose survival is both unexpected and precious, carried by men who understood, in the particular way that soldiers understand things about each other, that what had just happened in front of them was not something they were likely to see again. In the days that followed, as the front stabilized and the bridgehead held and the preparations for the Great January Offensive continued, the offensive that would eventually carry Soviet forces all the way to the Oder River, to the outskirts of Berlin itself. The documentation process began. The witnesses were gathered. The statements were taken. The records of the battery's fire and Shilin's role in directing it throughout the assault were reviewed against the tactical outcome of the day. The specific episode at the gun, the one that had happened when everything else was gone and one person was left with one weapon and made a decision, was examined as carefully as the chaos of combat allows anything to be examined afterward. The recommendation was written. The language it used was the official language of Soviet military citation, formal, measured, trying to translate the specific and physical into the general and institutional. It listed the facts as facts: the number of counterattacks repelled, the number of enemy vehicles destroyed, the conditions under which the action was taken, the wounds sustained. What could not fully capture, what no citation has ever fully captured in any war, in any language, was the quality of the experience itself. The cold, the narrowing, the moment when a person looks at a situation and makes a choice that the situation does not require, but that something inside them insists on anyway. Second gold star of the hero of the Soviet Union. He was 20 years old. The Vistula ran on. Berlin waited. And in a headquarters somewhere behind the lines, a general who had not yet seen the paperwork continued with his work, unaware that a document was coming toward him that would stop his hand in the middle of a routine review and make him say, in a voice stripped of its professional distance, to the adjutant standing nearby, "Is this the same Shilin?" Now we know the answer. The answer is yes. The same Shilin who stood on a bridgehead above the Dnieper and refused to be evacuated. The same Shilin who went to the gun when the gun had no one left to operate it. The same boy from Elshenka who had walked into a recruitment office in 1941 without being called, who had sat in an accelerated artillery school and learned in 6 months what was normally taught in years, who had looked at a battery of skeptical veterans and understood that the only way to earn what could not be given was to demonstrate it, personally, in the place where demonstrations cost the most. Yes, that's Shilin. There's a version of this story that ends at the gun. It is a satisfying version. It has clean edges and a clear emotional logic. The boy from the village, the impossible achievement, the gold stars, the triumphant conclusion. It is the version that fits most naturally into the grammar of heroic narrative, the kind of story that can be told in a few minutes and leaves the listener feeling something uncomplicated and warm. It is the version that gets printed on the front pages of newspapers and spoken into radio microphones and repeated at commemorative gatherings for decades afterward. It is also incomplete, not because the facts are wrong. The facts are exactly right. The Dnieper, the Vistula, the gun, the stars. All of it happened precisely as described, documented in official records that have no reason to exaggerate and every institutional reason to be accurate. The incompleteness is of a different kind. It is the incompleteness that comes from stopping the story at the moment of maximum clarity and refusing to follow it into the territory that comes after, the territory that is harder to narrate because it does not resolve neatly, because it contains contradictions that do not simplify, because it asks questions that the heroic version of the story does not have room for. What does a twice hero of the Soviet Union, 20 years old, carry with him when the guns finally stop? What is the weight of gold stars when the thing that earned them was also the thing that cost the most? These are the questions that Part 4 is about. And to answer them honestly, we have to follow Afanasy Shilin past the moment of victory, past the headquarters, past the citation, past the parade, into the quieter, longer, less photographed life that came after. The spring of 1945 arrived the way springs arrive after catastrophic winters. Not gently, not gradually, but with the sudden insistence of a world reasserting its fundamental nature after a long interruption. The trees along the roads of Central Europe produced their leaves with the same indifference they had always shown to human events. The birds returned. The days lengthened. The light changed. The guns moved west toward Berlin, and then they stopped. The formal conclusion of the war in Europe came in May of 1945, and the documentation of that conclusion, the ceremonies, the signatures, the official declarations, provided a framework within which millions of people attempted to understand that something enormous had ended and something else, still undefined, had begun. For the soldiers of the Red Army, many of whom had been fighting continuously for years, the end arrived not as a single clear moment, but as a gradual deceleration. Fewer orders, quieter nights, the strange disorientation of days that did not begin with the requirement to survive them. For Afanasy Shilin, the spring brought two things simultaneously. The first was the official confirmation of the second gold star. the signed decree, the formal recognition, the institutional acknowledgement that what had happened at the Magnuszew bridgehead in January was real and documented and would be permanently recorded. This was not a surprise. The recommendation had been approved. The outcome had been communicated through channels. But the formal confirmation has its own weight, separate from the anticipation of it. It transforms something that existed as a process into something that exists as a fact. The second thing was the full accounting of what the preceding years had actually cost. 7 wounds. This number appears in the records and deserves to be examined not as a statistic, but as a sequence. 7 separate occasions on which the machinery of industrial warfare succeeded in penetrating the physical boundary of the person who would become twice hero of the Soviet Union. 7 moments of impact, each with its own location on the body, its own severity, its own recovery period, its own addition to the cumulative record of what had been asked of a single human frame between the ages of 19 and 20. The fragment in the head, from the Dnieper. The wound to the arm, also from the Dnieper. 5 more, distributed across the months of fighting between those 2 rivers and beyond them, in the grinding westward advance through Belorussia and Poland that the official histories describe in the language of operational success and the participants remember in the language of survival. Some of these wounds were serious enough to require hospitalization. Some were treated at the front and endured. All of them left their specific residue in the body, scar tissue, altered function, the permanent physical record of proximity to destruction. A body that has been wounded 7 times by the age of 20 is a body that has been changed, not destroyed. Shilin survived, which is the precondition for everything that came after, but changed in ways that do not fully reverse, in ways that are present every morning and every evening and in every encounter with cold weather and physical demand, in ways that the person carrying them is always aware of even when the people around them are not. This is the physical side of the accounting. The other side is harder to measure and harder to document because it exists in territory that the official records of military institutions do not naturally map. It is the interior accounting, the sum of what was witnessed, what was ordered, what was survived, and what was not, what a person carries in the part of themselves that is not accessible to medical examination or official citation. Shilin commanded men in combat. This is a simple sentence that contains enormous complexity. To command men in combat is to be the person whose decisions determine, in part, who lives and who does not. It is to give orders that you know, as you give them, will result in some of the people receiving them being killed. It is to understand that this is necessary, that the alternative to making these decisions is a worse outcome, that the logic of defensive action requires accepting losses to prevent larger losses, and to make the decisions anyway, and to carry afterward the knowledge of what those decisions cost. The men who served under Shilin were not abstractions. They had names and histories and people who were waiting for them somewhere in the country that spread eastward from wherever the front happened to be. Some of them survived the war. Some of them did not. The ones who did not survive left a specific kind of absence in the memory of the person who had been their commander, an absence that is different from the ordinary grief of losing someone you knew, because it is entangled with the question of whether different decisions would have changed the outcome. A question that cannot be answered, but also cannot be put down. This is not guilt in the legal or moral sense. The decisions Shilin made were the right decisions under the circumstances. The record is clear on this, and the outcomes, in aggregate, support the judgment that his command saved more lives than alternative approaches would have done. But rightness and grief are not incompatible. A person can have made the correct decision and still carry the weight of its consequences. A person can have done what was necessary and still find that necessity does not fully resolve the experience of what was done. The men who did not come back, he did not forget them. The accounts of those who knew him in later life are consistent on this point across different contexts and different decades. He did not perform grief about it. He was not a demonstrative person, not given to the public processing of interior experience. But the names were present. The faces were present. In the way that the most significant experiences of a person's life achieve a kind of permanent residence in the mind, these were resident. This is part of what the gold stars cost. June 24th, 1945. Red Square, Moscow. The Victory Parade. There are photographs. There's film footage, black and white, slightly unsteady in the way that documentary footage from that era has a tendency to be, but clear enough. The columns moving across the cobblestones. The faces of the marching soldiers. The particular expression of people who are present at an event that they understand to be historic, that they know they will be asked about for the rest of their lives, that they're simultaneously experiencing and already beginning to remember. Among the marshals and generals and decorated officers, moving with the column that contained the representatives of his front, was a 20-year-old lieutenant with 2 gold stars on his chest. The photographs exist. The footage exists. He was there, documented, present in the visual record of one of the defining moments of the 20th century. Small against the scale of the square, young against the age of the event, one person among tens of thousands in a spectacle designed to communicate the scale of what had been accomplished. But he was there, and something about the fact of his presence in that column. A boy from a village in the Saratov region, who 5 years earlier had been thinking about what to do with his life, walking across the same cobblestones as the architects of the greatest military victory in Soviet history, contains an entire argument about what the preceding years had meant, about what had been required and who had provided it, about the relationship between the famous and the unknown in the making of historical outcomes. After the parade came the question that every soldier faces when the extraordinary context that has defined them is removed. What now? For some, the answer was difficult. The skills that war develops, the capacity for rapid decision under pressure, the tolerance for danger, the specific forms of competence that combat requires, do not translate automatically into peacetime life. The psychological adjustments required to move from a world organized around survival and immediate consequence into a world organized around the slower, more ambiguous demands of ordinary existence are real and documented and have affected soldiers across every war in human history. For Shilin, the answer took a particular form. He chose to remain a soldier, not because he had no other options. A twice hero of the Soviet Union, at 20 years old, had considerable social capital, could have leveraged his reputation into many different kinds of post-war life. But he chose to continue in the profession that had defined him, to go deeper into it rather than away from it, to build on what the war had taught him rather than attempting to leave that teaching behind. He enrolled in the Dzerzhinsky Artillery Academy, one of the premier institutions for the advanced professional education of Soviet artillery officers, a place where the theoretical foundations of what he had been doing in practice since 1943 were examined with the rigor and depth that wartime conditions had not permitted. He sat in classrooms. He studied ballistics and tactics and the higher mathematics of military science. He was, by all accounts, an excellent student, not because the material was easy, but because he brought to it the particular quality of attention that belongs to people who have already encountered the subject matter in its most consequential form. He was also, almost certainly, the only person in any of those classrooms who had personally done what the textbooks described. The career that followed was long and distinguished, and, in the context of the story we are examining, almost deliberately understated. He did not become a figure of public spectacle. He did not seek the platforms that his reputation could have provided. The commemorative speeches, the celebrity appearances, the role of living symbol that Soviet society offered to its acknowledged heroes, and that some of them accepted with evident satisfaction. He moved through the ranks of the professional military with the same steady, deliberate competence that had characterized his performance in combat. Doing the work, doing it well, asking for nothing beyond the work itself. Command of a regiment, command of a division, staff positions in the headquarters of military districts, The kind of work that does not produce dramatic stories, but that constitutes the actual substance of a professional military career. The planning, the training, the institutional maintenance of the capabilities that a country requires even when it is not a war. In 1975, he reached the rank of Lieutenant General of Artillery. This is a significant rank in any military. It represents a career of sustained high performance over decades, the accumulation of demonstrated competence across many different kinds of responsibility, the judgment of peers and superiors that the person holding the rank belongs there. It is not given automatically to heroes. It is not a consequence of past achievement. The Soviet military, whatever its other characteristics, did not typically promote people to general officer rank on the basis of what they had done decades earlier. It is earned repeatedly across a long career. He earned it, and through the decades of that career, he remained who he had been in the beginning. Not in the sense that people do not change, because he changed as everyone changes, shaped by experience and time and the specific pressures of his particular life, but in the sense of the qualities that the record consistently associates with him across every period. The directness, the absence of pretension, the focus on the work rather than the recognition, the loyalty to the people under his command. He did not talk much about the war. This is a detail that appears consistently in the recollections of people who knew him across different periods of his life. Not that he refused to discuss it. He was not secretive, not evasive, not the kind of person who uses silence as a weapon or a mystery. But he did not seek out the conversation. He did not arrive at gatherings looking for opportunities to revisit the Dnieper or the Vistula. He answered questions when they were asked, and the answers were factual and considered, and then he moved on. The people who knew him understood this as a quality of character rather than a pathology of avoidance. He had processed what he needed to process. The past was real and present in him. The scars were real. The names were real. The memory of what had been asked and given was real. But it was not something he needed to perform for an audience. It was his privately and permanently, in a way that the most significant experiences belong to the people who had them rather than to the stories that are told about those people. His scars were more eloquent than any speech he might have given. He did not give the speech. He wore the scars. There's a specific kind of respect that forms in people who have seen what Shilin's soldiers saw, who have watched someone they know, someone they stand next to, do something at the extreme edge of human capacity. It is different from admiration, which can be felt for people you have never met, for achievements you have only read about. It is different from professional regard, which is a judgment about competence. It is something more personal and more lasting, a form of knowledge. The knowledge of what a specific person is actually made of, purchased through direct witness in circumstances where performance cannot be faked. The men who served under Shilin carried this knowledge. Some of them were still alive decades later. Some of them gave interviews to historians and journalists who were piecing together the record. And what they described separately in different cities at different times, without coordination, was consistent enough to constitute something like testimony. They described a commander who did not ask them to do what he would not do himself, who was present where presence was most dangerous and most needed, whose calm under pressure communicated something about the situation that could not have been communicated in words. Not that the situation was not dangerous, but that the danger was survivable, that people were holding, that the thing could be gotten through. They described what it meant to them to have him beside them. Not the gold stars, not the citations. Him, the person, the specific, irreplaceable, particular human being who had been their commander in the places and times that had mattered most. This is perhaps the most important form of legacy, not the official record, not the photographs and citations and parade footage, but the specific modification of specific people's understanding of what human beings can do and what it means to lead them. He modified that understanding in every soldier who served with him. They carried it afterward, wherever they went for the rest of their lives. The gold stars on his chest and the photographs from the victory parade and from the formal occasions that followed it across the decades catch the light the way metal always catches light, with a clean, uncomplicated brilliance that has nothing to do with what they represent. What they represent is not clean or uncomplicated. It is 7 wounds and the specific texture of recovery from each of them. It is 3 days on a Dnieper bridgehead with a fragment in the skull and a damaged arm, and the radio still transmitting. It is a January morning at the Magnuszew position, alone at a gun, in the cold with the armor coming. It is the names of the men who did not come back, present in a memory that did not release them across the decades that followed. It is also, and this is equally real, equally true, equally part of the full accounting, the battery that held, and the bridgehead that held, and the soldiers who survived because of what happened at that gun, and the decisions that turned out to be right, and the work that continued for 30 more years with the same fundamental seriousness and care. Both things are true simultaneously. The cost is real. The achievement is real. A person can look at a twice hero of the Soviet Union in a parade photograph and feel the uncomplicated warmth of admiration for what was accomplished. That feeling is legitimate and the story that produces it is true. And a person can also look at the same photograph and ask the harder question: what does the person in this photograph carry that is not visible? What did the visible accomplishment require of the invisible interior? What is the relationship between the gold and the weight of it? And find that the answer to that question makes the story not less admirable, but more human, more real, more honest about what extraordinary things actually cost the people who do them. Afanasy Shilin did extraordinary things. He paid for them in the currency that extraordinary things always cost. And he carried both, the achievement and the cost, the stars and the weight of them, with the same quiet, steady, unpretentious seriousness that had characterized everything about him from the beginning. That is what the stars cost. That is what they were worth. Legends are convenient things. They take a complicated human being, a person full of contradictions, capable of both greatness and ordinariness, shaped by specific circumstances that will never be exactly replicated, and they smooth the contradictions away. They produce something cleaner and more portable, something that can be repeated in a sentence, something that fits into the grammar of inspiration without requiring too much explanation. Afanasy Shilin became a legend while he was still alive. This happens to some people, and it is not always comfortable for the people it happens to. There is a particular strangeness in being the living subject of a story that has already been told so many times that the telling has started to diverge from the experience, where the version that circulates in newspapers and commemorations and school history lessons has achieved a kind of independent existence, running parallel to your actual life, but no longer fully connected to it. He did not seem to find this particularly troubling. Or if he did, he kept that reaction private. In the same way, he kept most of his interior life private, not as concealment, but as a natural expression of a personality that had always been oriented outward toward work and other people rather than inward towards self-examination performed for an audience. What the legend said about him was true. That is worth stating plainly, because it is not always the case. Sometimes the gap between legend and reality is a gap of exaggeration, of stories grown larger in the telling until the original event is barely recognizable inside them. That was not the situation with Shilin. The documented facts were extraordinary enough that they did not require embellishment. The citation said what happened. The witnesses confirmed what happened. The legend, in its essential content, was accurate. What the legend left out was simply the human texture, the cold, the specific weight of artillery shells, the quality of the radio silence between transmissions, the ordinary moments that surrounded the extraordinary ones. The legend compressed time and removed friction and produced a narrative with the smooth inevitability of stories that are already finished, already resolved, already safe. The man had lived it the other way, forward, without resolution, into uncertainty, making decisions without knowing their outcomes. That difference between the experience and the story of the experience is not a criticism of a legend. It is simply the nature of the distance between living and narrating. Every story about a real event is, in some sense, a reduction of the event, a selection of details that fit the story's purpose and a setting aside of details that do not. The question is not whether the reduction happens, because it always does, but whether what remains after the reduction is honest about the essential nature of what it is describing. The legend of Afanasy Shilin, at its best, was honest about this. That an ordinary person, from an ordinary place, made extraordinary choices under conditions of extreme pressure, and that the choices cost something real, and that the something real was paid. That is the essential truth. The legend carried it forward, imperfectly but genuinely, into the decades that followed. The Soviet Union that Shilin served in his post-war career was a different country from the one that had sent him to the Dnieper in 1943. Not in every way. The political structures that organized Soviet life had a remarkable continuity across the decades. And the military institution he served within had its own deep continuities of culture and practice. But the texture of daily life changed, and the relationship between the war and the present changed, and the way the country understood its own history changed, sometimes abruptly, in response to political events that had nothing to do with history and everything to do with the present uses of historical memory. Shilin navigated this carefully, not in the sense of political maneuvering. The accounts do not suggest he was a person given to the management of his position through strategic self-presentation, but in the sense of a person who understood that the institution he served had its own requirements, and that meeting those requirements honestly and professionally was the appropriate response to the privilege of being trusted with command. He trained soldiers. He developed doctrine. He contributed to the professional knowledge base of the artillery arm of the Soviet military through the unglamorous, necessary work of a career officer who takes seriously the responsibility of passing on what he knows to the people who will follow him. This is a form of legacy that does not produce dramatic stories. It is diffuse and collective. It exists in the improved performance of units he commanded and the better preparation of officers he trained and the incremental refinement of practices he helped to develop. It cannot be photographed or cited in a single document. It is the kind of contribution that only becomes visible in retrospect, when you trace the lineage of competence forward through time and find that certain standards and certain approaches have a common source. He was that source for many people across many years. The question that his story forces into the open is one that military history tends to circle around without quite confronting directly. What is the relationship between individual action and collective outcome? The answer that the legend provides is simple. The hero acts, the situation changes, the battle is won. And this answer is not wrong. What Shilin did at the Dnieper changed the tactical situation. What he did at the Magnuszew bridgehead changed the tactical situation. Individual action in those moments had consequences that extended far beyond the individual. But the fuller answer is more complex. The individual action was possible because of everything surrounding it. The battery that responded to his coordinates, the infantry holding the perimeter, the logistics chain that put shells within reach of the gun he operated alone, the training system that had prepared him for exactly this kind of situation in the accelerated 6 months of artillery school. The individual was the visible point of a collective effort. The specific human face of an institutional capability. This does not diminish what he did. It contextualizes it in a way that makes it more comprehensible. Not less extraordinary, but extraordinary in a way that can be learned from, can be built toward, can be understood as the product of preparation and circumstance and character in combination, rather than as a gift from some external source that arrives randomly in certain people and not in others. He was prepared. He was placed in a situation that demanded the full use of his preparation. He used it. The preparation was real. The situation was real. The use was real. All three had to be present simultaneously. This is what his story teaches, if it teaches anything. In the last decades of his life, as the Soviet Union itself moved through its own extraordinary transformations, the reforms, the opening, the eventual dissolution of the state structure, he had served his entire career. Shilin remained who he had been. Modest in the specific way that people are modest when they have genuinely internalized the understanding that what they accomplished was larger than what they alone could have produced. Serious about the institution of military service in a way that outlasted the particular political system that institution had served. Loyal to the people who had been his soldiers, his colleagues, his subordinates. Loyal in the sense of remembering them, of keeping their experience present, of refusing to let the abstraction of history swallow the specific reality of individuals. He was asked, occasionally by journalists and historians working on accounts of the war, to describe what it had been like. He answered. The answers were factual and measured and contained, in their understated way, enough of the truth to be useful to the people who were trying to understand. He did not tell the whole story in these interviews. No one ever tells the whole story. The whole story is too large for any single telling and too personal for public presentation and too entangled with the interior experience of a specific person to survive translation into the general language of historical narrative. But what he gave was honest. And honesty in a person who had been through what he had been through and could have chosen to perform rather than simply describe, is its own form of generosity. The photographs that survive from different periods of his life show the expected transformations. The young lieutenant in wartime, the mid-career officer in the images from the 50s and 60s, the general in later years. The face changes the way faces change. The addition of lines, the settling of features into their permanent arrangement, the quality of expression that accumulates in a person who has spent decades thinking seriously about serious things. What does not change across the photographs is something harder to name, a quality of directness, of self-containment, of a person who is present in whatever situation they are in without performing their presence. It is the quality that his soldiers described. It is the quality that made his calm under fire communicative in the way that calm under fire sometimes is not theatrical, not constructed for effect, but genuine, and therefore capable of reaching people in the way that genuine things reach people, past the defenses that performance cannot penetrate. He was, in the end, what he had always been from the beginning. A person who showed up, who did the work, who held the position. Not because he was indifferent to the cost. He was not indifferent, and the cost was real, and he carried it. But because the alternative to holding the position was something he had looked at and found unacceptable, not abstractly, but concretely, in specific moments of decision where the choice was immediate and the consequences were clear, and he chose. 7 times through 7 wounds, across 2 rivers, in the winter and the autumn, and all the seasons of a war that lasted 4 years and changed everything. He chose. That is the man behind the legend. That is what the legend, at its best, is trying to say. We started in a headquarters. A general's hand stopped mid-motion over a pile of papers. A name on a document that did not fit the established categories of the possible. A silence in a smoke-filled room that lasted long enough to mean something. We have followed the name across 2 rivers and 4 years and 7 wounds and 30 more years of quiet professional life. And now we arrive here, at the end of the investigation, where investigations are supposed to deliver their conclusions. Here is what the investigation found. The mystery that stopped the general's hand was not, in the end, a mystery about talent or destiny or the random distribution of courage across the human population. It was a mystery about something more ordinary and more important than any of those things. It was a mystery about preparation, meeting circumstance, meeting character. 3 things that had to be present simultaneously, that are each insufficient without the others, and that together produce something the general's experience told him should not have been possible. Shilin was prepared. 6 months of artillery school, compressed and brutal, had given him technical competence. The early months of command, facing skeptical soldiers who were waiting to see what he was actually made of, had given him something harder to teach. The understanding that authority is not given but demonstrated, not held but continuously earned. He was placed in circumstances that made the full use of his preparation necessary. 2 bridgeheads, 2 rivers, 2 moments where the arithmetic of available force said that what was being attempted could not be sustained, and where the question of whether it would be sustained anyway came down, in both cases, to whether a specific person in a specific position would hold or would not hold. And his character was what it was, the thing that the record shows consistently. From the recruitment office in 1941 to the gun at Magnuszew in January of 1945, they produced the twice hero of the Soviet Union, given to a historian decades 20 later. Years old, a directness, whose name stopped a general's hand in the spring of 1945, an orientation that is the solution to the mystery, and the people rather than it is also, if we are paying attention, a capacity for decision in the absence not of instructions for becoming a willingness to be present in that is a specific context that most people will never inhabit. None of these 3 things alone would have been sufficient, but instructions for the underlying structure that made the specific achievement possible. Prepare seriously for whatever your actual circumstances require. Do not prepare for the version of events that would be convenient. Prepare for the version that is demanding, that expects more than you think you currently have, that will ask you to use everything you know and then ask for more. When the circumstances arrive, and they arrive for everyone, in different forms and different scales, but they arrive, understand that the question being asked of you is not whether the situation is fair or whether you are ready or whether you would have chosen this particular test. The question is simply what you will do now with what you have in the place where you are, and bring your character to it. Not a performance of character, not the version of yourself that you would present to an audience, but the actual, private, unobserved self that exists when no one is watching and the decision still has to be made. That is the pattern. It worked at the Dnieper and at the Vistula in the specific, dramatic, historically documented form of a young artillery lieutenant in the Second World War. It works in other forms, in other contexts, in other lives, with different stakes and different audiences and different definitions of what it means to hold the position. The stakes are usually lower. The consequences are usually less immediate. The guns are usually metaphorical, but the pattern is the same. There is one more thing that the investigation requires us to sit with before it closes. Afanasy Shilin was not unique in the way we sometimes use that word, not a singular anomaly, a one-of-a-kind deviation from normal human capacity. He was unique in the way that every specific person is unique, shaped by a particular combination of background and temperament and experience that was his and only his. But the capacity that he demonstrated, the capacity to continue functioning under pressure that would have shut most people down, to make accurate decisions when the environment was doing everything possible to prevent accurate decision-making, to hold a position that logic said could not be held. That capacity is not the exclusive property of people named Afanasy Shilin. It exists, distributed unevenly and in different forms, across the human population. It is developed by circumstances that demand it and atrophied by circumstances that do not. It is more common in people who have been seriously prepared and less common in people who have not. It is more available to people who have previously discovered, in smaller situations, that their limits are further than they thought. We do not know, about most people, where their actual limits are. We know where their experienced limits are, the places they have reached and found the edge. But the actual limits are further. How much further varies. The only way to find out is the way that Shilin found out, and it is a method that most people, rightly, prefer to avoid. What we can do instead is take the knowledge that the limits are further than we think and let it function as orientation. Not certainty. We should not pretend to certainty we do not have about what we would do in situations we have never faced, but orientation, a direction to face, a way of understanding the human capacity for endurance that is more generous than our everyday experience of our own limitations tends to suggest. He was 20 years old. He was from a village. He had no advantages of birth or wealth or connection. He had preparation, circumstance, and character. And he held. The general in the headquarters, in the spring of 1945, eventually put the document down and continued with his work. The war was ending. There were 1,000 things requiring attention, 1,000 decisions still to be made in the days and weeks before the guns finally stopped. But the name stayed with him. Names like that have a tendency to stay. They become reference points, fixed stars in the personal cosmology of people who witnessed or were adjacent to something that exceeded their prior understanding of what was possible. They become the thing you return to when you need to remember that the possible is larger than the familiar, that the expected is not the limit of the achievable. The human beings, under sufficient pressure, sometimes do things that the comfortable categories of ordinary experience have no room for. Shilin Afanasy Prokhorovich. Year of birth, 1924. Village of Elshanka, Saratov region. Twice hero of the Soviet Union. 20 years old. The investigation is complete. The mystery is solved. What remains is the question that every honest investigation eventually deposits at the feet of the person who has been following it. Not a question about Afanasy Shilin, but a question about the person reading these words, about the specific individual who has spent this time in the company of a story about human capacity at its most extreme. The question is not dramatic. It does not require a gun or a river or a war. It is simply this: what are you preparing for, and how seriously are you preparing for it? And when the moment arrives, in whatever form it arrives, in whatever scale it operates, in whatever context your particular life provides, will the preparation have been sufficient? That question has no universal answer. It has only the answer each person finds in the doing. Shilin found his.